Greetings, friends. So I want to begin by taking you back about 6 months ago, almost exactly 6 months ago to the day. It was the day after that winter snowstorm that shut down the Triangle, when I traveled here to Chapel Hill under a veil of secrecy, the members of your hard-working search committee bringing me over and sneaking me into the building. And as I walked into the sanctuary for the first time, I was struck in the entryway to the sanctuary. There's a plaque that hangs above that memorial book in the back, and the plaque caught my eye. There's a quote written on it by A. Powell Davies. It's written this: "We commit to precious memory these lives which were mingled with our own, the strength and loveliness of which remain to bless us." If you'll indulge me in just a few moments of Unitarian historical nerdiness, I'll say just a few words about Reverend Davies. A. Powell Davies served most famously at All Souls Unitarian Church in Washington, D.C., and he served there during the post-World War II years until his untimely death in 1957. In our nation's capital, he was a committed social activist, a prolific author, an unapologetic advocate for liberal religion, and a charismatic preacher whose sermons attracted so many people that All Souls began to rent meeting spaces out in the suburbs, and they broadcasted the audio of the worship services live to those remote locations. And I always love this. The story goes that members who attended worship services in those satellite locations thought it wasn't aesthetically pleasing for people to sit and stare at audio equipment. And so they hid the speaker behind a potted plant, and people would show up on Sunday for the Church of the Talking Bush. I always kind of like that story. In any event, A. Powell Davies is frequently associated with a quotation that is ascribed to him. It's a good quotation, and it's an idea I'd like to explore with you this morning. The quotation goes, "Life is just a chance to grow a soul." Life is just a chance to grow a soul. The quote may have come from a sermon Davies gave in 1947 entitled, "What to Do with Gloom?" And here's just a little bit of what he had to say on the subject of what to do with gloom. He said, "We can be sure that despondency and gloom, and indeed sadness in any of its intensities, can make us far more sensitive to ultimate meaning, can deepen us spiritually, can bring us closer to the greatness which is always trying to lay its touch upon us, or in shorter, more familiar words, can help us grow a soul. That, it seems to me," Davies continues, "is the first thing to know about gloom. That it is not necessarily a misfortune or a deprivation. If you can learn how to treat it, how to live with it when it visits you, it can be a means of spiritual development. This will never be so if you try to treat it superficially, or if you take fright at tragic realities. It will never be so if you attempt to bolster up your life with artificial gaieties. You have to accept sadness," he said, "but you must never surrender to it." And it really wasn't my intention this week to go poking around in a sermon called "What to Do with Gloom" on my first Sunday with you. And yet somehow the happiness in my heart, the thrill, the excitement, the joy, the celebration, the sweetness of this moment in time, this sweet time of being here with you, also coexists this week with a profound awareness of the acute pain in our world. And yes, it's true that acute pain exists in our world each and every week. But this week my heart feels it a little more than usual. I don't know about you. My heart feels it as I hear the stories of ongoing devastation in Iraq and Palestine, the waste of violence, the humanitarian crises, the deaths of civilians. My heart feels it as our nation watches the racism and the violence and the rage and the heartbreak in Ferguson, Missouri, as a community struggles to find justice for Michael Brown and for so many others following yet another case of lethal force being used against a teenager of color. And my heart feels it also as the suicide of a beloved entertainer again brings the pain of mental illness into the forefront of people's minds. It is as if the world conspires each day to remind us of the truth of that wise quote by E.B. White. If the world were merely seductive, that would be easy. And if the world were merely challenging, that would be no problem. But I arise each morning torn between a desire to save the world and a desire to savor it. This makes it very hard to plan the day. And alas, it does not make sermon writing any easier either, if only. So let me talk to you a bit today on this subject of how to grow a soul. I can hear a few of you saying, what in the world do you mean by that? Or, define your terms, please. As to say, when I talk about the soul, I'm not talking about a material object, I'm talking about something else. There is a different working definition I'm using when I talk about soul. I want to say that I'm talking about the human capacity to be fully present to the realities of our world without being subsumed or swallowed up by the world. I really like the poet Szymborska's clever and literary approach to speaking of matters of the soul. She writes that our lives are on loan from us, that every bit of our lives could be taken from us save for the one thing which cannot be taken, which is our soul. Soul. In writing this sermon, I did a little bit of free association of images I could share to try to explain kind of what I was getting at here. And the image that kept coming into my brain was one of those cliche examples from popular culture. Soul, we might say, is what the Who's in Whoville have left even after the Grinch cleans them out, and is what grows in the Grinch and when his heart grows 3 sizes. Soul is what I imagine when I hear that Christian blessing of benediction. May the peace that passeth all understanding, the peace which the world can neither take nor give away, abide in your hearts and bless you this day and forevermore. That peace is which the world can neither take nor give away. And soul is the strength found in the resistant song, we shall not be moved. Like a tree standing by the water, we shall not be moved. Fully present, yet not overcome. Soul, I believe, is as good a term as any for what grows, for what is discovered in the Buddhist story of Kisa Gotami. This story is a story I first heard in the Unitarian-Universalist Sunday school of my youth. One version of the story goes that there is a woman named Kisa Gotami whose only child, a son, is taken ill quite suddenly and dies. Heartbroken, she goes to the monks and the miracle workers in her small village, and she begs them to use their powers to resurrect her son. Reluctantly, they tell her that such an act is beyond the scope of their powers, but they leave a window of hope open and advise her to travel to visit with the Buddha. If there is anyone with such power, it is most certainly him. So Kisa Gotami travels and meets with Buddha, explaining her tragic loss, and begs him to bring her son back from the dead. Buddha tells her that he can do this, only she must first find a bowl of rice from a home that had never known grief or loss. Intrepidly, Kisa Gotami sets out across the Indian countryside, visiting kitchen and hearth, finding no such bowl. no such rice. Only story after story of loss. In these visits, these conversations, she finds empathy and understanding and consolation. The story goes that she returns to Buddha not bearing the elusive rice, but with soul and spirit and wisdom. Or as A. Pal Davies puts it in his sermon on gloom, we can be sure that despondency and gloom, and indeed sadness in any of its intensities, can make us far more sensitive to ultimate meaning, can deepen us spiritually, can help us grow a soul. So how do we grow a soul exactly? It's a good question. There are, of course, all manner of spiritual roadmaps, theories of faith development, self-help programs, and others still promising a plan for spiritual growth. I find many of these rubrics, from Fowler's 7 stages of faith development to the Eightfold Path of Buddhism, to be helpful. And I'll always remember attending a workshop given by one of our very fine UU ministers, Reverend Kendall Gibbons, on the subject of spiritual maturity. I thought, that'll be an hour well spent. And she began by introducing us to a schema that she had come up with detailing the 12 qualities of spiritual maturity. This was good stuff, and it was overwhelming, and I don't think I've ever felt quite so far from enlightened self-actualization as I did in trying to wrap my head around all of that. We don't learn all the ins and outs of how to grow our souls in an hour workshop, much less a 20-minute sermon. It's something we never quite fully figure out, I think, that we consistently struggle with. But E.B. White's quote from earlier in the sermon about trying to figure out the beginning of each day, whether to save the world or savor it, actually poses a false dualism, I think. It can't be an either-or proposition. If you enjoy the world without caring for it, that will turn out to be somewhat empty. And if you try to care for and change the world without love in your heart, you'll risk becoming bitter and angry. The key is to somehow be able to hold both. Imagine if just one word was changed on that plaque in the back of the sanctuary. Imagine if it said, "We commit to precious memory these lives which were mingled with our own, the strength or loveliness of which remain to bless us." Save and savor, strength and loveliness. It has to be both. The key, I think, is somehow to be able to do both. To live in that tension of experiencing joy and wonder and fascination and love, even as we face into the pain and the sickness of this world, even as we actively resist the forces that harm and cheapen life. There are some people great of soul whose lives and whose examples show us that it's possible to both save and savor the world. Jesus of Nazareth most certainly lived these two realities simultaneously. Nelson Mandela absolutely did as well. I think the Dalai Lama embodies this sense of soul. I think this is what Henry David Thoreau was working towards. But it is a both and. The world needs redeemers, peacemakers, justice workers, builders of a new world. We need people to be what Martin Luther King Jr. called drum majors for righteousness, actively bending the moral arc of the universe towards justice. And the world needs lovers of life whose souls are attuned to beauty and to loveliness, who are drawn to beauty in all its forms, especially that beauty within the human spirit, within the human soul that the world cannot take away. So it is, like King said, that power without love is reckless and abusive, and love without power is sentimental and anemic. And so this day, remind us to save and savor. Remind us of strength wedded to beauty. And turn us in our coming together towards the growth of our souls. So may it be. And amen.